The Bob Murphy Show, episode 438.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today I am going to replay a recent interview that Alex Bernardo, who hosts the Protestant Libertarian podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, had with me, where he wanted me to give the whole deal about the Federal Reserve to a American Christian audience. If they just don't get it. Like, why do some people care about the Fed so much? Which says end the Fed? What's going on with all that? Okay, so that's what we do. And I knew going into this that we were probably going to touch on things that I don't normally talk about or say points in a way that, is different from my usual stump speech, as it were. And so I asked him on the front, I said, hey, I'm going to record this stuff on my end. Is it okay if I do a lag and then, run this in the Bob Murphy Show? And he said, sure. All right. So this is not filler. This really is the kind of thing where I'm able in this format to get things across because he's asking me the questions. He knows this is the kind of stuff that my audience needs to hear. And so it ends up coming out differently than if I did this solo and just talk to you people about this stuff. So if you've been listening to me rail against the Federal Reserve here on the Bob Murphy Show or on the Human Action podcast for the Mises Institute, there are things in this that, you haven't heard, at least recently, from me. Specifically, he asked me near the end about, why should a Christian care about this stuff in particular? Okay, so that's my prelude to the discussion I have with Alex Bernardo on the Federal Reserve. Hope you like it.
All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Bob Murphy. Dr. Murphy is an Austrian economist, a Christian, and an author of numerous books and articles, and host of the Bob Murphy Show. He's an outspoken critic of the Federal Reserve and conducted a recent zero hedge debate where he argued for its abolition. Today, he will be explaining the history of the Fed, its terrible track record, and why Americans should oppose it. Dr. Murphy, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. Like we said before we hit the go button here, I've been following your work for some time, so happy to do it.
Well, and that's a huge honor to me. I've wanted to have you on the podcast for a long time, and I've also wanted to have someone on to discuss the Federal Reserve. And so it just so happened when I listened to that zero hedge debate last month, I was like, well, maybe this is the perfect topic for Bob Murphy to come on and explain to my audience. I love what you do. I love your work, and I'm excited to introduce you to maybe like the 5 people that listen to this that don't know who you are. So before we get into talking about the Federal Reserve, which is, I think, one of the most important issues that the average American doesn't understand, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Sure. So I'm a professional economist. I went to Hillsdale College for my undergrad. From high school days when I knew I wanted to go into economics, I pretty soon discovered and realized that, it's Austrian economics in particular that I want to specialize in. So that's why I went to Hillsdale. They have Mises' personal library there. Then I went to NYU to get my PhD for similar reasons. There was an Austrian fellowship. I taught at Hillsdale for 3 years. I did some work, research work down at Texas Tech. And now I'm in the financial sector. I am the chief economist for what's called Infinio, which is a fintech company that we're putting life insurance on the blockchain. And probably for relevance to this discussion, I'm also a senior fellow with the Mises Institute. And was throughout my career, both in academia and then even now what I'm doing at Infinio, I do a lot on money and banking, and so that's why it made sense that Zero Hedge came to me to say, hey, do you want to take the case of why we shouldn't have the Fed?
Yeah, and you've written and spoken a lot about this in your career, and I think your book, The Great Depression, was really eye-opening for me just to see how much of a role that played, because that is definitely you don't get a sense for just how important the Fed was to the Great Depression in your high school history textbooks. That's something that they seem to leave out, and so you connected that dot for me in a way that was really powerful. I guess it was last month at this point you did a debate on Zero Hedge, as you referenced, about the Federal Reserve, where you were in conversation with someone who wanted to reform the Federal Reserve, but thinks that we basically essentially need it. And you were arguing in favor of its complete abolition. So talk to us a little bit about that debate, like how it got set up and how you thought it went.
Okay, sure. So the moderator was George Gammon, who's a great guy on this stuff. And it was a bit unfair, but I think he was neutral in the debate, but he, like, on his own podcast, George will have ball caps that say "End the Fed" on them, so it was kind of ironic. But that's partly why they picked him, just because that's his topic. The guy I was debating against, David Beckworth, also your listeners, he's a strong, solid Christian. He even brought it, worked in some stuff about talking, comparing himself to an Old Testament prophet, or both of us to Old Testament prophets at the end there. So yeah, as you said, I was making the case that we should just get rid of this thing, and David is steeped, and he's very familiar with the Austrian school. I don't think he calls himself an Austrian, but he respects them. He studied under George Selgin, I believe. And so, he's very into the free banking literature. So he agreed that, yes, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have central banks, but given that it exists, it would make more sense to try to reform it right now, that we're not going to get rid of it anytime soon. And even if we did, there'd be all sorts of calamity. So why don't we just be more realistic and try to reform it for the better? So that's kind of the approach he took. So on the one hand, there wasn't like a huge difference in our overall perspective, but I think it lent itself to a very reasonable, pleasant exchange of, a discussion in terms of, just laying out the issues and not just screaming at each other. So I was really happy with how it went. And I think we, for the listeners, explained the different perspectives on it.
Yeah, it was a lot more civil than Dave Smith's debate with Alex Berenson a week or two ago. So, no, it was very informative. But this is one of those, really the goal in having you on today is to help my audience understand what the Federal Reserve is and why it hurts Americans. So when I bring up the topic of the Fed, the majority of the people that I talk to, even people that are like kind of libertarian oriented, such as you and I, their understanding of the Federal Reserve is that it controls interest rates and makes it easier or more difficult for them to buy a house. And that's pretty much all that they understand the Fed to do. But there's a lot more to it than that. And it is very complicated, which is why I think people just have a hard time grasping how prominent of a role it plays in American society. And so I'm going to go through just some basic questions just so my audience can get a better handle for how this works. And I really do want to say this because I know, some of my personal friends that listen to the show that are like Fed curious, this is the episode for you. Like, I want you to listen to everything that Dr. Murphy has to say here. This is extremely important stuff. So we're going to start with just
actually, Alex, if I could just underscore what you're saying, because I've noticed too, like a lot of Trump fans, who in general, especially like the more intellectual ones that, have read a bunch of free market, maybe they love Thomas Sowell, that kind of thing. A lot of them, when Trump is bashing Powell for not cutting interest rates, they're on Trump's side. Like, this guy's, being real stingy or something. And so, as I'm sure we'll get to in the course of this discussion, Alex, that's like from an Austrian perspective, like, no, you're not doing the economy any favors by cutting interest rates if you're the Federal Reserve. That's just going to stimulate another boom bust cycle.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. And I want to get into that because it's so important that people understand it. But we'll just start with a basic question, because I remember when I first got into Austrian economics a few years ago, like I was vaguely familiar with the Fed. I became an adult at the same time that the Great Recession took place. And so I remember reading like articles in Time magazine back then where they were talking about, I guess it was that Ben Bernanke at that time talking about the way that he managed the whole thing. And but I didn't really understand how it worked. So before we even like get into the heavy stuff, what is the Federal Reserve and like how does it work?
Sure. So the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. Other countries, like there's the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. Now in Europe, there's the ECB, the European Central Bank. But before that was established, they had their individual national ones, like the Bank of France and so on. So that's what, it's the central bank. The U.S. was actually slow to the game in the sense that the Fed was only formally established in the United States in December of 1913. And so at the time, in the lead up to the Fed, the agitators who wanted it were writing, you know, op-eds in the New York Times and things like that, it's making the case that, you know, hey, all the civilized great powers, they all have a central bank. We need one too. We got to get with the program, you know. So that's what you know, that's what it is. So it's like the banker's bank, right? So Citibank and Bank of America, whatever, they all have accounts with the Federal Reserve, and the Fed also, you know, if you look in your wallet and you see your $20 bill, your $100 bill, whatnot, look carefully, and it says Federal Reserve note. So right now, the currency that we use, what we think of as U.S. dollars and cash, those are actually notes issued by the Federal Reserve. So that's, and also in practice, the Federal Reserve has a lot of the regulatory authority over the U.S. banking system.
And there are really three stated goals that the Federal Reserve attempts to accomplish. What are those three goals, and why did they choose them? Okay,
so, well, it sort of morphed over time. So, like, originally, you know, when it was first founded, one of the main goals was it was supposed to be what was called a lender of last resort. And so here, just a real quick backstory, there's what was called the Panic of 1907, right? And just there were periodic ups and downs and crises, you know, in the financial sector. And there was no central bank at the time. People might remember from history class, there had been what was called the Second Bank of the United States that Andrew Jackson famously did not renew the charter of. And he even put that on his gravestone that I killed the bank, right? So from when the Second Bank of the United States did not get renewed all the way up until the founding of the Fed, the U.S. did not have a central bank, period, right? So when there were these recurring financial crises, you know, if companies were in trouble, what would they do? They would go to like the rich financiers, like the private bankers, and, you know, seek a loan. And so people were saying, hey, this is kind of crazy. Like J.P. Morgan himself was personally deciding which businesses were going to go under and which were going to survive in the 1907 crisis. So we need to have a central bank, just like England and France and all the cool kids have, so that, you know, in the authorities, the experts operating, you know, with the general interest in mind, not just J.P. Morgan deciding what's good for his balance sheet, but, you know, people picking winners and losers that way. So that was kind of the argument. And so again, that function of the central bank was called the lender of last resort. Now the Fed's, I guess, charter or the statute governing the Federal Reserve was amended in the 70s after Nixon went off the gold standard. And there they brought in what's called the dual mandate. And so there the idea is that, oh yeah, when the Fed's setting policy, the two main things it should try to do is, number one, to smooth out the business cycle, like in practice, meaning like don't let unemployment get too high, right? So that's kind of, you know, to try to keep steady, stable employment. But then the other element of its mandate was to, I forget the exact wording they used, but the idea was to maintain stable purchasing power of the dollar. Right, because in the 70s, that's when, you know, there was rampant price inflation. And so the idea was the Fed is supposed to try to do those two things. Like on the one hand, try to prevent or minimize the severity of recessions when they happen, but also you don't want to have crazy inflation. So you want to have, like, you know, in an ideal world, employment's always going to be low and stable, and consumer prices are only going to rise at a very modest rate. That was kind of the newfound goal at that point.
Yeah, and this is where I think it might be important too to differentiate between price inflation and like the Austrian understanding of inflation. What's the difference between those two? Because they're sometimes conflated and people don't really understand how they differ from one another.
Sure, yeah, and this was something that Ludwig von Mises stressed a lot in his writing. And then, as you're saying, like the modern day Austrians, a lot of them really, you know, thought he was making an important point that originally. So this isn't some like crank obscurantist view. It was, you know, it's pretty standard. If you go back and look, that the way economists and, you know, financial commentators, what they meant, like as of the year 1900, what the word inflation actually meant to those people was inflating or expanding the quantity of money and bank credit, right? Because by some definitions, like bank credit is part of the money stock, right? So that's what it meant to inflate. Meant you're pumping up, you're inflating the money supply, and then normally a symptom of that or a consequence of that would be that prices of consumer goods would go up, right? And then Mises explained that over the course of the 20th century, gradually people, when they started referring to inflation, they meant the symptom, not, you know, what we would say is the cause. The inflation, that term came to mean the rising prices. And when I say rising prices, remember, what we mean is like stuff at the grocery store, eggs and gasoline. We don't mean the stock market going, because people don't complain about inflation if their stock portfolio is going up. They love inflation there, or even if home prices are going up. That's not what people mean when they say, "Oh, wow, inflation's bad," right? Because they own their house, and it's bad for people trying to buy a new home. But you get the idea. So, what people nowadays mean by inflation, they really mean consumer price inflation. But again, he says he didn't think that was just an innocuous, harmless shift in terminology. He said, no, that's insidious, because now, like, you have Federal Reserve officials saying, "Oh, we promise to really be vigilant against inflation," when they're creating more money as they speak. And so his point was, now you can't even, if you can't even name the thing that's causing the problem, how do you fight it?
Right. Yeah. And there really isn't anything innocuous about the Federal Reserve. And this is where I think now that we have a good baseline, I want to go and talk about the history of the Federal Reserve a little bit. And this is something that you brought up in your interview. This is in your or not your interview, but your debate. And your perspective on the origins of the Fed is actually based on information that was released by the Federal Reserve itself. I remember like a couple of years ago, I read a book on the Federal Reserve called Lords of Easy Money by, I think, Christopher Leonard's the guy's name. And it's funny because at the beginning of it, he's like, there are all these people that have these conspiracy theories about what happened at Jekyll Island, and they kind of paint the Federal Reserve as this nefarious organization, but we need one, but it's also been a giant failure for the last 20 years. So I just thought it was funny the way that he framed that. But like, when we go back to the origins of the Federal Reserve, it's a pretty dirty deal, the way that this thing came about. So talk to us about the way in which the Federal Reserve in the United States was created.
Well, sure. And so you alluded to this. Let me just say it explicitly. When you get into this genre of people talking about the Fed and its connection, like the central banks of the world, and the connection to the various sides in the two world wars and stuff, it can get, from pretty straightforward and unobjectionable facts that everybody stipulates down to like, really, say conspiracy theories. What doesn't mean they're false. And I'm saying, so there's a whole spectrum of stuff. And so, yeah, what I want to stress here is the stuff that I alluded to, in the Zero Hedge debate, and what I'm talking about right now with you, Alex. This is coming from the Federal Reserve's own website, right? This is federalreservehistory.org, where they commissioned this going into their centennial, and they had some people. So this essay called "The Meeting at Jekyll Island," is, again, this was something that historians put together, and the Fed now hosts it on its own site. And it says, let's see, I'll just read a little bit. In November 1910, 6 men, Nelson Aldrich, and then it lists some other ones, met at the Jekyll. Nelson Aldrich was a senator. Met at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. The meeting and its purpose were closely guarded secrets, and participants did not admit that the meeting occurred until the 1930s. And then the plan written there was the precursor to the Federal Reserve Act. And so, again, they met in 1910, and they didn't even admit publicly that meeting had even happened until the 30s. Right. And this was, and the Federal Reserve legislation was passed in 1913. And then that article, goes on to say, because a bunch of them were like, guys on Wall Street or whatever. And so normally you'd think, so they would get on the train in New York. No, they went to New Jersey to like try to be sneaky about it, so there wouldn't be as much press around. And they only used their first names when they got on the trains to not tip off, the people who these important guys were. And they also, the official story when they went down and met at Jekyll Island is they just said they were going there to go hunting or something, right? So it was, again, a very secretive meeting, because they knew, because it was involving people like a senator, a bunch of people from like Wall Street, and a foreign bank. So the point was, they knew if the word gets out that this group of people is writing the precursor to the legislation that's going to set up the U.S. central bank, the public is not going to be for it. So I'm just saying, from its very inception, it was shrouded in secrecy. And so that can, give some tip off that something screwy going on just even right from the get-go.
Yeah, and why was there a 3-year lag between when it was originally drafted and when it was passed into law by Woodrow Wilson?
I mean, is there something specific? Are you just asking in general? Or
Yeah. So why was there a 3-year gap of time between that? Was it just they were waiting for the opportune moment, or?
Oh no, I mean, they were going back and forth with various revisions and things like that. It's been a while since I've reviewed like the full history. Murray Rothbard does a great treatment in his writings to go through step by step what happened. But yeah, they, like, among other things, just to give people an idea, so like, why is it called the Federal Reserve? Because they there 12 district banks, right? So that's where the federal is coming in, right? And so the point was they didn't just call it the Bank of the United States because they thought, oh, Americans are very much suspicious of centralization. So originally, there were 12 banks spread around the country, called the Federal Reserve Banks. And so that's partly why it was like that. So a lot of the answer, there was a lot of negotiations and things like that in terms of like, well, where would the cities be? And, there were some obvious ones like New York and Chicago, but then some of the smaller cities, it was, there were various candidates. So there was a lot of jockeying for things like of that nature. But also, again, they had to build up support because the American people were very skeptical of, centralized power in the hands of bankers. Another thing too, just to make sure, I don't want to forget to say this, is the Federal Reserve is like a quasi-private public organization. It is literally the banks own shares of stock in the Federal Reserve. It is literally owned by the private banks. Okay. And so, and it pays them dividends. So for example, just for an analogy, that would be like if the FDA were literally owned by the pharmaceutical companies and paid them dividends. And people could see like, well, that'd be kind of a crazy, the entity that's supposed to regulate and make sure the pharmaceutical companies are, doing things above board that are in the public interest is also owned by them. That's kind of weird. Well, the Federal Reserve, which regulates the banks and has requirements making sure what they do is in, the public interest, is literally owned by the banks. All right. So I'm just saying it's not that the FDA is, in my view, a good, completely benign organization because it's government run. But I'm just saying how naked, some of the potential corruption is here is kind of, that's an interesting element of this.
Yeah, no, that is a great starting point. Now, I do want to talk about like the Great Recession and what's happened since then, kind of on its own, because I think for a lot of people that was, at least for a lot of people that are my age, that was the first time that we were really exposed to the Federal Reserve. But the nominal goal of the Fed is to stabilize the U.S. economy and make sure that the economy grows without a lot of speed bumps. Between 1913 and like 2007, 2008, what's the track record of the Federal Reserve during that time?
Sure. Yeah. And so here, there's a great paper by George Selgin, Larry White, and William Lestrapes. I think I forget how to say that guy's last name. And they just do it like using conventional mainstream economic analysis and just evaluate the Fed's track record. And so in terms of, maintaining the purchasing power of the dollar, it's not even close. If you look at the pre-Fed period, like from like 1800 to 1900, that 100-year stretch, the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar was roughly constant, meaning like what you could buy with $100 in the year 1800 was basically what you could buy with $100 in the year 1900. Okay, so that's astonishing. Like you just think of how different that is to today. From 1913 to 2013, no, the dollar lost, like 99.97% of its value, something like that, right? So on that score, it's obviously not even close. But then even on the score of, economic volatility, that it's not the case that, okay, yeah, they debased the dollar, but in exchange, at least we have, a more stable economy. No, what's the greatest economic crisis and, depression in U.S. history? Obviously, the Great Depression. The Fed was formed in 1913, was up and running in 1914. The stock market crash happened in 29, right? So the Fed was on the job for a good 15 years before, the 29 stock market crash that paved the way for the Great Depression. So clearly the Great Depression is happening well in the Fed's watch. And then like the second biggest calamity is the Great Recession, which happened, 2007, 2008, right? So the two worst ones. And then just, empirically, like using average figures and such, Selgin and White and Lestrapes show in their paper that the percentage deviation from trend growth, which is like a fancy way of saying, how volatile was the economy in terms of like the ups and downs relative just to the trend, was worse during the period of the Fed than before. Okay, so again, no matter how you slice it, the U.S. economic performance was more volatile after when the Fed was existing than beforehand. Right, so it's, again, on any metric you want to pick, the Fed has been, a failure, at least relative to the counterfactual of what if things were the same as they were before the Fed came out of the scene. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then also, too, just one last one on that issue of being a lender of last resort. What they did, especially like in the Great Recession, the financial crisis, is the exact opposite of what the received wisdom would have been when the Fed was founded, right? So that when they founded the Fed and said you got to be a lender of last resort, the idea was not to bail out any company that gets into trouble. No, the idea, like Walter Bagehot's famous dictum, he had been writing in England decades earlier, but his famous dictum was, in a crisis, the Bank of England should lend freely or liberally, but at a high rate of discount, meaning like at a penalty rate. So the idea was, provide liquidity, but charge an above normal interest rate on those short-term loans. And the point was to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? That if there's a firm that just goes, there's this crisis and they have a short-term cash crunch, but they're basically a solid enterprise, their fundamentals are sound, then they might say, we'll borrow money temporarily at a high rate just to get through, a few months to get through this crisis, this storm, and then pay the loan back. And so those are the firms that you want the central bank lending to. You don't want some company that really just was a creature of the bubble, and that should go down when the crisis hits. That you want them getting washed out, but that's not what the Fed did in 2001. They cut interest rates down to zero and held them there for 7 years, right? So that's clearly not acting as the lender of last resort. That's just printing up money and just handing it out to everybody.
Yeah, and and I want to talk about the Great Recession as well, because there is a lot of confusion around it. And I know, like, your friend Tom Woods, he wrote that excellent book, Meltdown, which kind of explains from an Austrian perspective what happened during the Great Recession. But people talk about it as a historical event. We know that it was bad, but no one really has an analysis as to why that happened, except for Austrian economists like you. So what took place during the Great Recession, and how are we kind of still living with the consequences of that?
Well, sure. So the lead up into it, the basic story that Mises developed and Friedrich Hayek supplemented, and actually Hayek ended up winning the Nobel Prize for this work. Mises' basic story of why in a market economy are there why is there the business cycle? Why isn't it just that the economy tends to grow at a certain amount each year? Yeah, some businesses would go under, but statistically, how come that's just not a small portion year by year? Why is it there's this cluster of mistakes? It seems like there's this boom when lots of firms are expanding, unemployment comes way down, and then there's a crash and lots of businesses fail all near the same time. Why is that? And Mises thought it's because of credit expansion, that the banking system extends credit even though there hasn't been genuine saving by the households, and that pushes down interest rates. And that sort of gives a false signal, a green light to businesses to borrow more and start longer term projects because capital is cheaper to borrow now. But there isn't adequate real savings, to get the economy to the finish line. And so that's, in Mises' view, why you have these periodic crises. So if you buy that basic story, the central bank just exacerbates all that. And I have tons of stuff that I did at Mises.org documenting this, but the preceding housing boom or bubble was fueled in part by Federal Reserve policies, right? There were other things that the federal government had in place that kind of channeled this credit into the housing sector. But following the dot-com crash that happened in 99, 2000, Alan Greenspan at the time was the head of the Fed. The Fed brought interest rates down to 1%, which was historically really low, and that started pumping up this housing bubble. And at the time, certain people were praising him. Like Paul Krugman infamously said, he was quoting some other guy, but he was clearly endorsing it, said that, in order to promote recovery, that we have to replace the dot-com bubble or the NASDAQ bubble with a housing bubble. Or he probably said boom. He probably didn't say bubble, right? So Keynesian economists were applauding that at the time. So it's, blowing up this big housing and general asset bubble in the mid-2000s. And then the Fed gets cold feet. They start raising rates. And then that's right when you see housing prices kind of peak and then start falling. And if there's a speculative bubble, once the prices start coming down, then everybody starts getting out, right? Like, in other words, if there were people buying 2 and 3 houses to flip, once prices start coming down, they get out of it right away because, oh, geez, I got to, cut my losses. And then that just is, an accelerating process. So that, was kind of the catalyst. And then on, in the financial sector, there were a bunch of financial institutions who had been engaged in what you might call shadow banking, where they had all sorts of liabilities, tied to mortgages, and they were given rosy ratings by the ratings agencies. And so there were a lot of firms, 2007 going into 2008, that realized their calculations were wildly off. And so if the authorities had just sat back and let it crash, there would have been, some fallout, and a lot of companies would have gone under. But it's not like the real resources of the economy would have disappeared, right? It's just a lot of, rearrangement of claims on property and so forth. And then I think, they would have reached their bottom pretty quickly, and then you would have had solid, sustained recovery after that. But that's not what happened. That the Fed made incredible changes to its policies, in the fall of 2008. And so, for one thing, like they just started buying all sorts of mortgage-backed securities. Like at the time, people were calling them toxic assets.
Yeah.
And so the Fed was coming in and doing all sorts of stuff. I mean, they established all these lending facilities, just to give you an idea too of like the dubious legality of what they did, put aside the economics. But it was like the Fed wasn't legally allowed to just go out and buy mortgage-backed securities, right? But instead they could lend to all sorts of things. So they established these LLCs called Maiden Lane, because that was like, a street that's near Wall Street. So it was Maiden Lane LLC and Maiden Lane 2 LLC or something like that. And then the Fed would lend money to that LLC, and then it would go out and buy mortgage-backed securities. So the Fed says, "See, we're not buying. What are we talking about?" Right? So it's like they were doing all kinds of goofy stuff like that. But anyway, and this was all, so up till then, like it would have been unheard of, like for the Fed to come in and just spend, tens of billions of dollars buying derivative products that people would have said, "Whoa, that's distortionary. There's a lot of scope for corruption there," and especially in a time when a bunch of people were about to lose a bunch of money on these assets, and then the Fed to come in and kind of just take them off their books at par and just rescue them, like that's clearly, a bailout is what that is, right? So that would have been frowned upon, but because, hey, it's a crisis, and, they were just really ginning up in the public the idea that we're going to go into the Great Depression 2.0 unless the Fed does all this stuff, that's why people were okay with it. And then at the same time, last thing I'll say here, Alex, is another major policy innovation the Fed made right in this time is in October of 2008, they started paying interest on reserves, right? So up till then, commercial banks, if they had reserves, meaning they had like extra money that was above their legal reserve requirements, they could just leave it parked at the Fed, and then, they could lend it out to people or whatever, use as the basis for advancing loans. And they before that period, they didn't get paid anything for doing that. And then in October of 2008, the Fed began actually paying banks interest on that. In the beginning, it was low. It was 25 basis points. But, as I put it at the time, I said, this is when the Fed started paying banks to not make loans to their customers, which is one way of viewing what that was. And so right when they were, bailing out all these big financial institutions that had made bad investments during the bubble years and were kind of caught with their pants down, right when the Fed's rescuing them, and they're telling the public, "Oh yeah, we hate to bail out Wall Street, but we need to keep credit flowing to Main Street," is also when the Fed began literally paying banks to keep their reserves parked at the Fed rather than lending them to people.
Hey everybody, Bob Murphy here with a quick tip for small business owners. If your business isn't showing up online, your competitors are getting the leads and you're missing out. Well, that's where Persist SEO comes in. For over 15 years, they've been helping local businesses grow through SEO, paid ads, and the latest in AI-powered search optimization, so you stay visible and competitive in the digital age. Whether you're in-home services, legal, or healthcare, Persist SEO delivers real results without locking you into long-term contracts or overwhelming you with tech jargon. Visit ineedseo.help or call 770-580-3736 to schedule your free consultation. That's ineedseo.help. Easy to remember, powerful for your business.
We're still living with the consequences of a lot of these policies today. And there are a lot of great resources out there that kind of track down how this works. But I want to kind of focus on the way now that the Federal Reserve impacts the average American, because a lot of that is, it's really helpful to understand, but it can be very abstract until we look at the way that it does like directly impact how we live. One of the things that the Federal Reserve is responsible for is devaluing the dollar. Obviously, like when I was in high school, Subway had the $5 footlong, and that is an ancient relic of the past, right? Like, you can't buy with $5 in 2024 what you could buy with $5 in 2004. And it's the same thing you were talking about earlier, between 1913 and 2025. Like it's like the dollar's just lost almost all of its value. So I want to ask how the Fed devalues the dollar, but then like obviously they wouldn't do that if some people didn't benefit from it, right? So like the average American doesn't seem to benefit from that, but if it screwed everyone over, like they just wouldn't do it at all. So how do they do it? And then who's the one that benefits from that?
Sure. So things became much simpler and cleaner, as it were, after 1971. So up until 1971, technically, the U.S. authorities, had to redeem dollars for gold, at least vis-a-vis other central banks, right? That FDR, when he came into office in 1933, ended the redeemability of the dollar for gold, for average people. But through like the post-war, what was called Bretton Woods era, other central banks could turn in their dollar reserves and get physical gold shipped to them if they wanted to. And then in 1971, Richard Nixon just said, you know what, even that, we're not doing that anymore, just because they knew we've been printing so much money because of Vietnam and the war on poverty and whatnot that we're going to lose our gold if we do that, right? So that's, and at that time, just to give us people a sense, that the the Bretton Woods price of the dollar vis-a-vis gold was $35 an ounce, just to show you how strong the dollar was at that point. And then once Nixon said, you know what, we're not committed to that anymore. We're not going to give you an ounce of gold if you give us $35 anymore. So that untied the Fed's hands, and it's not a coincidence. Oh, yes, Nixon did that in 1971. And when did consumer price inflation, even outside of wartime, get really bad in the U.S.? Oh, yeah, it was in the 1970s, right after he did that, right? So that's, again, not a coincidence. So anyway, to answer your question, Alex, mechanically what happens is the Fed has this special privilege where if they want to go out, they had the various rounds of QE. We were just talking about what happened. The crisis hits in 2008, and the Fed decides, among other things, we're going to start buying mortgage-backed securities that will, sort of put a floor under their price, and kind of the idea was to prevent, fire sales and things like that and systemic risk. Okay, so there's $10 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities that people in the private sector own, financial institutions. The Fed wants to buy it and take it on their books. So what does it do? It electronically writes checks for $10 billion and gives it to the owners of those things and obtains ownership. And you say, well, where'd that $10 billion come from? And the answer is it didn't come from anywhere, right? It's not that the Fed has this pile of money that it draws down upon. It just literally creates the money in the act of buying stuff. All right, so that's kind of the answer. And then, simplistically, how does that make everybody else poorer? Well, because now there's more money. Right. And so here, we obviously, Alex, take it as deep as you want. We can get into the nuances and the different, but I think just for people to understand it from step one, if your neighbor down the street, all of a sudden you just notice that he starts driving a Ferrari, and then he, he puts in an in-ground swimming pool, and he just starts getting all this stuff, and he's wearing, Armani suits and stuff. And you go and ask him, did you get a good job or something? He goes, oh no, he's kind of, and then you go and you sneak in at night and look. And in his basement, you see he's got a printer, and he's printing off $100 bills. And then you realize, oh, he's just counterfeiting money. That's how he's doing it. How should you feel about that? And there's a sense in which you're mad, right? Like, oh, he's stealing from the rest of us. And so if you just think through how exactly that, when he goes to the dealership and buys the Ferrari, he's not sticking a gun in the guy's belly. He's giving him what that guy thinks is money, and that guy goes and spends it. So ultimately, even if the authorities never realize those are counterfeit, even if they just continue to circulate as the real thing, he's still, when you say, how is it that he has a Ferrari and a pool now and these fancy clothes, he's somehow like siphoning real resources from the rest of us. And when you're trying to put your finger on, but how is that actually manifesting itself? How are we actually poorer? It's because when you go to buy stuff, prices are higher because of what he's been doing, and your paycheck does not keep pace with it. So that's why what economists would say, in real terms, you are poorer, even though, there's this, you might not be able to understand exactly how is it that he's doing that to you, right? So it's the same thing with so does he benefit from that? Of course he does, because he's the one who has access to that money. And so it's the same thing with the Fed. The reason they benefit is they can go buy assets just by pressing buttons. And yes, that makes prices go up, but if you're the one who has that new money first, then you benefit, and then, some people that are second and third in line might also like the process, but eventually, you can't make everybody richer just by printing $100 bills. And obviously it's electronic. I'm just saying $100 bills just to let people, think about it.
Yeah, well, and this is why, like, again, as they continue to expand the money supply, but the economy doesn't grow at the same rate as the growth of the money supply, this is why prices go up, because it's going to create choice. And this is exactly really what happened during COVID.
Right.
That not only did they print like what $6 trillion or digitally create $6 trillion or something like that in response to COVID, but they put restrictions on shipping and on production, and so they actually contracted the amount of goods and services that were being produced and artificially inflated the money supply at the same time, which created this perfect storm. And a lot of people didn't see it coming. They love like the $600 checks they got from the government. They thought it was great. And then 2 years later, they can't afford to buy groceries for their kids. And I think that this is the thing I want you to comment on, because this is what's so frustrating to me about this, is that, especially from a Christian perspective, like, we're supposed to be about like thrift and saving and charity. And it's very easy to plan for the future when you know that 10 years down the road, if you put $100 in a savings account, that $100 will buy you the same amount of like goods and services as it would when you initially put it in the savings account. But like, based on these inflationary monetary policies, it just doesn't. And so, like, in a lot of ways, this would seem to be like the real driver of consumerism. It's not necessarily like individual greed. It's like, I'm going to buy something now before it becomes more expensive later. And then also, like, I think Wall Street is the one really that benefits from this the most, right? Because maybe I don't have this 100% correct, but it would seem to me that as the government expands the money supply, there's more of an incentive to invest our money in Wall Street instead of just putting it in a savings account where it would sit, because we could at least get a return from Wall Street. Whereas if it sits in the savings account, then it just loses value over time. So maybe talk about that dynamic a little bit, like the way that kind of drives consumerism, and then also just makes it impossible to like save or even make any sort of like reasonable economic decisions about the future.
Yeah, everything you just said there is perfectly correct. With this stuff, it's hard to know, well, if history had gone a different way, what would have happened, because you don't
Right.
know for sure. But definitely, like in the 40s and 50s, the average household was not invested in stocks. And certainly it wasn't that when you said to someone, oh, well, how are you going to pay, afford your retirement? People weren't saying, well, because I got all this money, in a well-diversified portfolio of the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones or whatever. Right. That's not what they did historically. It is funny. Mises has some passing references to these things too, and scattered through his work. But the average household, back in the day, they would save they would have like railroad bonds and savings bonds. And they also, a lot of it would be in life insurance. Right? People might remember in It's a Wonderful Life in the beginning, when, George is, he needs to come up with money, and he goes to the rich banker down the street and he gives him his life insurance policy and says, well, how much is in that? And a lot of people looking at that nowadays, like, how do you life insurance? Why that doesn't have it, right? Because it was a certain type of life insurance with its permanent policy, and that's how people used to save, was in their life insurance policy. Whereas that got completely discredited in the 1970s for the reason you're saying, that going back to what we said a minute ago, price inflation went through the roof in the 70s, especially for peacetime. And so people who had these conventional fixed income instruments that were just, paid a fixed rate of return, just were getting crushed because, price inflation was rising at 8% a year, and you're only earning 3% on your savings bonds. That's untenable. And so that's, and there are other innovations like no load mutual funds and stuff like that. So I'm not saying that it was completely due to that factor, but that is when you started seeing the mass shift of people thinking like, oh yeah, you got to get into stocks just to stay above water. Whereas before that was more of a speculative thing that, oh yeah, if you're a savvy investor and you want to risk that and go ahead, and if you think you want to go research companies, whereas like you're saying now, everybody has to be in the stock market or else you're going to get killed. So that phenomenon is harmful. That's not good. Right, that the average household should not be trying to pick stock. And people can say, well, it's a diversified portfolio. But even there, just the fact that you're in the stock market as opposed to something else is a choice. And so that's not just a law of nature. That's because of our debased money stock.
Yeah. Well, and we also run the risk too. I mean, I know it's kind of like a joke among libertarians, but like everyone in the country of Zimbabwe is a trillionaire, but they're trillionaires because like the government just prints more and more money, and a loaf of bread costs $1 trillion, right? So that's something that a lot of Austrian economists like yourself are concerned about is that if we continue to expand the money supply and devalue the currency, then at some point the US dollar is not going to be worth anything. So what do you think about the prospects for the US dollar in the future? Or like, are we in danger of collapse? Is there a way to come back from the brink and restore some sort of stability to our currency? Where do we sit right now in your perspective with the US dollar?
Okay, sure. And let me just say though, so you're absolutely right that that hyperinflation is a concern, is a thing that could happen, but sometimes I worry that if we say that it makes it sound like, oh, as long as they don't literally crash the dollar, then there's no problem. That's not the case. You know what I mean? Just even this gradual erosion, like we're saying, like you're losing purchasing power over time. And again, the thing that you just alluded to a minute ago that I talked about, the fact that people feel that they need to be speculators now, and that's just that's just a given, I think is bad economically, but also it kind of corrodes the culture, right? That people, I think there's I really do think it would be different if you grew up in a world where the money was gold and silver coins that had some heft to them, and that if you went and worked and you got paid and you could have it in I think there's just like a certain rock solid realness to that, whereas now like people don't think the money's real,
right?
And I noticed like during the financial crisis, right when there were the bailouts, then that seeped into the popular culture, and like some car dealership would say, come on down and get your bailout at Freddy's, and come, prices are blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Like everyone was just talking about that. And so I think, the like old fashioned conservative ideas of thrift and hard work and saving for the future. It's like, no, you're going to be a sucker if you do that. Don't do that. Just look for the quick thing. Right. So I think that all ties together. And that's even if they don't quote crash the dollar, that's just, given the status quo. But as far as your question, I had a piece arguing that I think the dollar is just going to continue since like 2000. The proportion of the dollar in terms of foreign exchange reserves among central banks, right? So if central banks have like gold, and they also have like a basket of currencies. I mean, it could be like government bonds in those currencies held by different things. And so obviously the US dollar was the biggest component, and then the euro. But in terms of the percentages from 2000 to when I did the analysis, I think I went to 2022, something like that, the dollar had fallen pretty significantly in that. And if you just extrapolated, I think it was like by 2045, it was going to be below 50% of that, right? So I think what's going to happen is before the turn of the midpoint of the century, I don't think the dollar is going to be called the global reserve currency anymore. I'm not saying that the Chinese yuan or some other currency is going to replace it. I just think things are going to get so splintered, and it'll be like a multipolar world. Just like I don't think the U.S. is going to be the global superpower 15 years from now. I think it's going to just be like, it'll still be powerful, but I think it'll be China will have its sphere of influence, and it'll just be given that the U.S. can't mess with them over there. They're not strong enough. So I think likewise, the dollar will still perhaps be the strongest global fiat currency issued by a government, but it's not going to be, people aren't going to matter of factly refer to it as the global reserve currency, I don't think, 20 years from now.
Yeah. All right. So the track record of the Federal Reserve is not good, and we've looked at the way that it harms average Americans and distorts the economy. So make the case, why should we end the Fed, and then how should we do it?
Okay. Yeah. So again, in terms of how should we, or why should we do it, just as I've pointed out, like its founding was dubious. What they're doing now is it's also there's a lack of transparency, right? So if you believe in, given that we have this government and it's ostensibly serving the people, and my favorite example of this is in December of 2008, right? So just a few months after the financial crisis hit, Bernanke, the head of the Fed at the time, goes in on some congressional subcommittee or whatever, and he's testifying as to all these extraordinary lending programs. There's all these windows that the Fed were opening up for firms with certain assets. They pledge those assets as collateral, and we give them funds and blah blah blah. And just billions and billions of dollars short-term loans that keep getting turned over. And somebody asks him, Chairman Bernanke, we're not second guessing your decisions, but just in terms of transparency, can you've outlined and given us the statistics on how many billions the Fed has lent since September. Can you give us a list of the recipient institutions? Like, who are you lending all this money to? And Bernanke said, well, no, I can't do that because the whole point of this program is to restore public confidence. And if the public knew that a particular financial institution used one of these facilities, they would think that their balance sheet was in trouble and there'd be a run. And so it would defeat the purpose of the program. So my point was is not only did Bernanke not need their permission to do this, he didn't even tell them who he's lending the billions of dollars to. right? And so that's just kind of crazy. Like if this is a public institution doing that, like the scope for corruption. So, for all those reasons, and then again, by any metric, any track record you want to use, not just like Murray Rothbard's crankish statistics. Right. I'm saying standard mainstream stuff. The Fed clearly has not performed as well as, the era before the Fed. So that's the argument as to why I think we would be better off without a central bank. And then to say, well, how would you do it? So just very quickly, I would say that what you have to do is there would still be the U.S. dollar, right? So in a perfect world, I would just think money and banking would be completely decentralized and let the market do it, and there'd be gold and silver coins and people would use Bitcoin, stuff like that. Right. But I want to be practical, not just freak people out, just one step at a time. So I'm saying, logically speaking, it's distinct to say you could get rid of the central bank and still have the dollar. One way to see that is, as of the year 1912, what were Americans using as the money? They were using the U.S. dollar, but the Fed wasn't created till. So clearly, Americans can use U.S. dollars somehow issued by the federal government that are not, creatures of the Federal Reserve, right? So those are clearly different things. So I would say they should transfer that dollar creating authority back to the U.S. Treasury, and then just privatize the existing Federal Reserve banks, right? So the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has all kinds of intertwining agreements with, the ECB, and there's currency swaps and all this stuff. And so admittedly, if they just turned all that off next Tuesday, the global financial crisis, system would probably crash. So you don't have to. But what I'm saying is take away the Fed's special privileges, that going forward, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, it can stay in business, but it can't create money the way it can right now, right? So just like Citibank can have currency swap arrangements and blah, blah, blah with the ECB, but Citibank cannot legally create U.S. dollars the way the Fed can right now. So I'm saying take away that special privilege and just have it be a regular bank with the same prerogatives and privileges that any other big bank has. And then as far as, so the ability to issue U.S. dollars now goes back to the Treasury. What rules should they use? And here I just said, I liked a proposal Mises made, I think in the 50s, about how you could get the U.S. back on gold. And the idea real quickly runs like this. So you're tying it back to gold. And the idea is just to say it would be difficult and costly to try to go back to 100% gold backing of the dollar. So instead of doing that, just right now, you lock in the market price of gold. It's like $3,400 an ounce, something like that right now. And just say, okay, we're locking in that price. Now going forward, the U.S. Treasury will, through the mint, will create more dollars, or having electronic reserves on deposit with us if you want. But for us to create new dollars like that, you have to come bring us gold. So you come and you give us an ounce of gold, and we keep it in our vault, and we will print up 3,400 new U.S. dollars and give them to you. And so going forward, if all new official lawful money created that way was backed 100% by gold in the vaults, well, then over time, the gold backing of all dollars would asymptotically approach 100%, if you get what I'm saying, right? Is that so? That in a nutshell that's a big nutshell because I talked about, but that's my idea for how you could do it.
So in the meantime, obviously we're not going to abolish the Fed anytime soon unless there's some kind of like political miracle. But in the meantime, what are some common sense reforms that we can impose upon the Fed that would rein in its power? And then I think even more importantly than that, we would have to have the political will for something like that to happen. Like state representatives would have to get lit up by their constituents in order for this to take place. How do we go about convincing like the average American that the Federal Reserve is bad for them?
Well, I mean, just doing shows like this, I think. Also, I think it's kind of a two-pronged thing that actually, rather than focusing so much on why it's bad, but just showing them here's how you could get rid of it and it wouldn't be Armageddon, I think is part of it. Because I think a lot of people, if they just assume, we can't get rid of it, they don't care why is it bad. It's just kind of like, it's here, so what's the point? But so I think it's like both elements of that 1-2 punch are important. And that's also why I like to stress, like in England, they could say, well, geez, we've had the Bank of England since the early 1600s. Right. So we can't get rid of that. That'd be nutty, right? So that would make more sense to think like that. Whereas here, it's such a good rhetorical card, I think, to play is to say, no, all through the latter half of the 1800s, you had amazing, strong industrial growth up until 1913. The U.S. did not have a central bank. And that, the U.S., that's when it became an economic powerhouse. So I think, just reminding people of that and then showing, again, the Fed's track record. it's not just that the Great Recession happened on the Fed's watch, but that in the early 2000s, there was like a birthday party for Milton Friedman. And it was Friedman's work that had blamed the Great Depression on mistakes made by the Federal Reserve officials at the time in like 29 and 1930.
Yeah.
And so Bernanke, at the time, he was not the Fed chair. He was just like on the board of governors or something. And so Bernanke at this birthday party says to Milton, he's got the mic and he's saying to Milton Friedman, if I may slightly abuse my position as a member of the Federal Reserve, Professor Friedman, you're right. We did it, meaning we caused the Great Depression. But thanks to your work, we won't do it again. He said that in the early 2000s, right? So my point is just these guys keep, thinking, okay, we got it now. And they just keep plunging the world into a financial crisis over and over. So I'm saying that's going to keep happening. And one of the main elements of that is the central bank that people have to realize. This is not just like, yep, that's capitalism for you. No, it's central banks are the engines that drive the inflation that causes the big booms and then the big busts that happen afterward.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this episode today. I have one more question that I want to ask you before we leave. And I think in a lot of ways, this is the one that's the most important to me because you've demonstrated just how harmful the Federal Reserve is for average Americans. Why should Christians in particular be concerned about this? Like, why is this something that those of us that believe in Jesus should oppose? What's the we see the harm that it does to society. And it doesn't seem to me like there are very many people in my Christian circles, at least, that are concerned about this. But I think they should be. Like, why should this be something that is a big issue for Christians in particular?
Well, sure. So perhaps of specific relevance to people listening to the Protestant Libertarian podcast, there's a tight connection between central banking and war, right? And in fact, some of the proponents of the central bank will say things like, well, if there's a war, we got to have the central bank because sometimes, you could be in a situation where the government couldn't tax or even borrow enough to pay for the war effort. So you need to be able to just create money. And so the flip side of that is, if we didn't have a central bank, that means our rulers wouldn't be able to take us into so many wars. They just couldn't afford it, right? So that's one element. And even there too, it's not that the Fed created more battleships and tanks and bombers. It's just that it gave the authorities knew, like in World War I and II, if they tried to levy explicit taxes or even just floating, treasury securities that were paid via genuine saving by the private sector, there's no way the public would have tolerated the expenditures of those two wars, right? So it's just like it's circumventing the public's consent. It's not that they're magically creating more real resources for the war effort. It's just you're like tricking the people into handing those resources over by just creating the money. Just like the counterfeiter, how is he getting the Ferraris in the swimming pools? It's not because the community is agreeing voluntarily to what he's doing. There's like some deception or something, chicanery involved. So that's another reason too, just in general, Christians should be dubious about this, that it is an engine by which politically connected people get access to real resources that they otherwise wouldn't, right? The money is not honest when there's central banking involved. Maybe that's a way of putting it. And so if you believe in honest weights and measures and things like that, then, this is an abomination. And also too, again, it would be one thing if, yes, you've got your moralistic concerns and your sort of orthodox fuddy-duddy ways, but the record speaks for itself. Right. When you have scientific experts engaging in, immoral inflation, look at what happens. The economy grows, but no, it doesn't. Right. Again, and this is not according to, Murray Rothbard's telling. Under any standard metric, economies, have been more volatile with central banking than without. And so they're in practice, they do a horrible job of it. They bail out, rich, politically connected people when there's a crisis, just like in 2008, 2009, they bought the mortgage-backed securities and rescued the big banks that had been invested in those assets, but plenty of people lost their houses, right? So just, showing how that works in practice. So again, Christians who are supposed to be for honesty and integrity and weights and measures and, minimizing war and looking out for the poor and the oppressed and to make sure that, the elites don't run roughshod over them. If you care about those things, you don't want to have a central bank.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. Well, Dr. Bob Murphy, we've been doing this for about an hour now. This has been an incredible overview of the Federal Reserve. I hope that my audience will continue to do more research and think about how this impacts them in particular. And I hope that we can all agree that we should end the Fed. Before I let you go, you've published a lot of books. You have, I know that you host your own podcast, but then you're also, I think, the host of the Human Action podcast as well. So for people that want to follow you and that are interested in your work, where can they find you on social media and where can they find the work that you do?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So on social media, on Twitter /X, I'm at Bob Murphy Econ. So that's where you can go. If you go to my podcast, bobmurphyshow.com, you can see links to a lot of my stuff. So I'd send people there. As far as my work, if you're interested in this stuff, yeah, Alex, you alluded to, I'm the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and New Deal, which goes through a lot of this stuff in terms of what happened in the 20s and the 30s. And then also my recent book from the Mises Institute called Understanding Money Mechanics, where you can just get the free PDF. You just Google my name and Understanding Money Mechanics. You'll be able to get that, where I walk through all the theory and the history of this stuff.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Murphy, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.